everyone, and welcome to APS Webinars. Today, we will be wrapping up our summer webinar series with the Science Policy Career Panel. I'm Midhat Farouk, and I will be your host for today's broadcast. Thank you all so much for joining us. APS Webinars are brought to you as a service of the American Physical Society, connecting you with the expertise of individuals who can offer insight into physics careers, educational programs, and professional development for students, working physicists, and educators. A quick, friendly reminder, if you're not yet an APS member, we do encourage you to join today. You can go to aps.org/membership to learn about and enjoy the many member benefits offered. Today's panel features 5 science policy experts who I will be introducing shortly. While we have some prepared questions, most of the program today will belong to you. Because of the number of people attending this webinar, we are only accepting text questions. So if you would like to ask a question, please click the questions button located at the bottom of the Zoom window and type your question into the pop-out questions box. You may submit questions at any time during the panel, and we will do our best to answer all incoming questions. After the panel discussion, we will move into an interactive Zoom meeting to allow for networking with our experts. Finally, a link to the recording of the panel discussion will be emailed to you after today's event and will be made available on the webinar homepage. And so with that, let's get started. Today we have 4 panelists who will be discussing their science policy careers. Our first panelist, Reba Bandyopadhyay, is a legislative and science policy analyst for the Office of the National Science Board, the statutory governance and policy board of the National Science Foundation. In this role, she specializes in congressional affairs and national science and engineering policy. Prior to this, she spent 2 years as a AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellow at NSF. Reba entered the science policy ecosystem as the American Physical Society's Congressional Fellow in 2014. As a policy fellow in the office of Senator Brian Schatz, she worked on the senator's education, science, space, and aviation portfolios. Reba is an astronomer who, in her 2 decades of research life, studied X-ray binary stars in our galaxy using many different ground and space-based telescopes. After attending MIT and Oxford, she was a National Research Council Associate in the Naval Research Laboratory's Space Science Division, a UK-based staff astronomer for the International Gemini Observatory, and then research faculty in the astronomy department at the University of Florida. Next, we have Dr. Neha Pankow, who recently completed her 2nd year as a AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellow at the National Science Foundation. In her first fellowship year, she worked on program management in the Engineering Directorate. In her 2nd year, she worked on agency-wide policies in the Office of the Director. During the course of her fellowship, she published 2 journal papers from her postdoctoral research, led the Fellows Mentoring Affinity Group as a co-chair, and was invited as a speaker at the largest STEM education conference in Southeast Asia. As part of the 2026 Idea Machine Working Group at NSF, Dr. Pankow received the Director's Award in 2020. Dr. Pankow got an undergraduate degree in mechanical engineering from Rashtriya Vidyalaya College of Engineering in India, after which she moved to the US for graduate work at the University of Michigan. As a graduate student, she built custom microscopy setups and studied the biophysics of transport and cells. She then pursued the intersection of protein engineering and cancer cell biology as a postdoctoral fellow sponsored by the American Cancer Society at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Starting in high school, Dr. Pankow has been constantly seeking means to give back to society. Both in India and the US, she has volunteered through nonprofit organizations in areas including sanitation, mental health, STEM outreach, gender equality, and prevention of child abuse. These outreach experiences, in addition to her several years in various STEM environments, have fueled her aspirations to work on policy issues addressing STEM education, outreach, and diversity. Our next panelist, Annalise Blum, is a AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellow supporting stabilization and peacekeeping operations in the Office of the Undersecretary for Defense for Policy at the Department of Defense. In this role, Annalise works on prevention of conflict, stabilization, environmental security, and cultural heritage protection. Previously, she was a visiting fellow with the American Meteorological Society's policy program and postdoctoral fellow at Johns Hopkins University. Trained in water resources engineering, Annalise has conducted multidisciplinary research on floods, droughts, access to safe water, and ecological impacts of environmental change. Annalise worked as a research assistant at the Center for International Development at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government and served as a fellow at the National Academy of Sciences and the U.S. Geological Survey. Annalise has a PhD in Environmental and Water Resources Engineering from Tufts University, an MS from UNC Chapel Hill, and a Bachelor of Science from Stanford University. Our fourth panelist, David Lang, is the Senior Director of Government Relations at the Optical Society in Washington, D.C. Here he directs the organization's advocacy and public policy programs. Prior to joining OSA, David was with the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine for 14 years. At the National Academies, he worked on more than 20 projects across physics, space, and earth science, and telecommunications. David received his Master of Engineering and Public Policy, a joint degree, from the University of Maryland, College Park in 2011, for which he focused on energy policy and technology. He completed his Bachelor of Science in Astronomy and Astrophysics in 2002 at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. We also have with us today Mark Alcesser, who will be moderating the panel discussion. Mark is the Associate Director of Government Affairs for the American Physical Society and has worked at the Society for 7 years. In his role, he works closely with APS's Chief External Affairs Officer to develop and implement advocacy strategies to advance APS's policy priorities, doing both managing the office's day-to-day activities and representing APS on Capitol Hill and with the executive branch. Prior to joining APS, Mark served as Science and Technology Policy Fellow, supported by the California Council on Science and Technology, in the office of Assembly Member Ken Cooley of California State Legislature. Mark is a chemical engineer by training, graduating with a bachelor's degree from the University of Michigan and receiving his PhD from the University of California, Santa Barbara. Welcome, Mark, and all panelists. And with that, I'm now going to hand it over to Mark. Please take it away.
Thanks, Midhat, for taking the time to introduce such an esteemed panel. And I'm delighted to be joined actually by several folks who have ties to the University of Michigan. So that's great to see. It looks like we have we're nearing 100 participants on the webinar already. And I think a number of them are probably folks who are either graduate students, early career scientists, et cetera, who are looking at careers in science policy as a potential next step for them. So just as a point of entry for folks on the panel, and maybe we can start with Reba, curious if you could give some advice to folks who are joining on what they might want to do in order to prepare themselves for a career in science policy.
Hi, everybody, and thank you so much for inviting me to join you today on this panel. Please let me know if my audio cuts out. So if you're really interested in science policy and you're currently at an early stage in your career, I encourage you to, first of all, to reach out to people who have done policy fellowships, particularly the AAAS, whether that's through the Society's congressional fellowships or through the executive branch fellowships, and really have some one-to-one chats to learn more about what actually these fellowships, what we do in them, the kind of breadth of things that we do, because it's very difficult to capture what work people actually do in science policy and what that means. It means people do different things in their different roles, and it's very hard to get a sense of that from things like the websites that describe these policy fellowships. So I really encourage you to reach out to people. I also encourage you to do kinds of exploration on anything locally that you might be interested in terms of civic participation or policy, even things like governance at your university or in your department. Those are all things that that can be really relevant to see what the kind of tasks you would need to do and the kind of work you need to do as a policy person, because it ends up being talking about how to work in teams and how to work towards a goal, and all in a space that's not about science research. So I'll stop there. And
thanks, Reba. Others on the panel, Annalise?
Sure, thanks. First of all, that was a really good answer. I was writing that down, Reba, so I remember to suggest that. I guess my first suggestion is, and kind of very similar, is to try out science policy to the extent that you can. And like Reba mentioned, doing local things. I know there's, I think, an organization called Engaging Scientists and Engineers in Policy, the coalition that used to have happy hours, still has the virtual happy hours, I believe. So that's one way to connect with people. There's groups that specifically try to bring scientists in to do local activities. You can also try to do congressional visits days. Some of those are hosted by scientific societies. I did one at AGU a few years ago. It was a really great way to meet my representative staff. It forced me to learn more about my representative and understand what issues they cared about. It was also a great networking opportunity to meet someone else in my district, another scientist who is interested in policy. And I think trying out science policy as a first step is really important for two reasons. First, to make sure you like it, and then also have a better understanding of what parts you like and what you are more interested in doing and less interested in doing. And then second, if you've done these experiences and had some science policy experience, it'll make you more competitive when you apply for science policy fellowships like the AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellowship, which I'm currently doing, or the Mirzayan Fellowship, the National Academy of Sciences, which I did about a year ago. The more that you can speak to the opportunities that you've pursued and that you've had and why you liked those and what you learned from them, I think the better candidate you'll be.
Right. Thanks. And for those on the call who, aren't currently pursuing a PhD, eligible for a AAAS fellowship, some of the congressional fellowships, et cetera, David, do you have advice maybe for folks who are currently in the undergraduate stage of their career?
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks to you all at APS for inviting me here, and thanks for the great introduction. Humbled to be joined by such accomplished scientists as well on the panel. I would say for an undergraduate student, certainly echoing, I think, what Reba said about reaching out to contacts and their contacts and their contacts, and just kind of working your way down the line to talk to people, learn about their experiences, where they've worked, what they've liked, what they don't, but really with the eye to figuring out what you're interested in doing, what kind of place you want to work, where you want to work, geographically, what type of institution or company, or nonprofit or university, because universities also have a lot of policy shops as well. And then also kind of what type of policy. There's public policy like a think tank, research type of organization. There's more activist types of organizations, pure lobbying firms, professional societies like APS, like mine, the Optical Society, and figuring out kind of where along how much influence you want to have on the decision-making process, how much you want to be a part of that, or how distant you want to be from it. I think those thoughts can begin to, and ideas can begin to bounce around one's head, even at the undergraduate stage. And as an undergraduate, you still have the opportunity, of course, to take policy classes that you might not have in graduate school.
Great. Neha, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Sure. First of all, I'd like to thank APS for this opportunity. I'm really happy to be here. I would echo exactly what David said. Undergrads have two, I wouldn't call them benefits, but there's two differences. One is that you can take these policy classes. The other thing is that I would encourage undergraduates to take every opportunity to volunteer. It may not be a full-time job, and it may not be a fellowship with a label to it, but every volunteer experience, it not only builds your resume, but it also helps you build in your mind what it is that you're seeking. So the more diverse the volunteer experiences you have, the more likely you're going to hit upon something that strikes a chord with you. And that's what you want.
Great. These are all great pieces of advice. And I'd like to sort of follow this line of questioning and talk a bit about volunteer experience, applications, things that make people ultimately competitive, right, for these positions. I personally am involved in the APS fellow selection process, so I can provide some opinions on that as well. But maybe starting again with Reba, what do you think makes somebody competitive for a science policy fellowship, as an example?
That's a great question, and I one of the things that I learned, I actually applied a couple times. This is just as by way of a sort of specific advice. I applied the first time that I applied to these fellowships as if I was applying to an academic position, and discovered rapidly that that was not the right way to go about it, because it's not just about your academic accomplishments, right? So we're accustomed to putting in applications that talk about our publications and all of our references are people who we worked with in an academic setting or in a research setting. But in this application and this kind of thing, you should think about what kind of other experiences you've had. So as Neha was saying, you were talking, if you've had volunteer experiences, if you've worked on civic projects, if you've worked on university projects, if you've worked with your graduate student association, if you've worked with your disciplinary association, or if you did one of these congressional visits days that Annalise was discussing, all of those things are really important to highlight, to describe how what has brought you to policy. Why are you interested in that? You want to kind of explain in that space when you're applying for a job, what is it that really has motivated you to think about this as a potential career path, or even whether it's a full-time, like a long-term career path, or just to explore it, what has brought you to that? And so taking an inventory of any prior experience you've had that's not specifically within your sort of research bench laboratory kind of realm is really important. And then bringing, when you do that kind of an application, maybe contact those people for potential references, people that you've worked with in that context, to show that you have this broader range of experience when you're kind of coming to apply for that fellowship, to demonstrate that prior experience. And again, you can think of that very broadly. It does not have to be you don't have to have volunteered with a political organization. Think broadly about it. But what is it that you have done that you really enjoyed outside of your specific, bench research, so to speak, experience, and bring that into your consideration.
That's a great comment. Other advice in this piece in terms of what makes people more competitive when applying to these fellowships?
Sure, I can just jump in. As she was talking, I was just thinking communication is a really big part, and being able to communicate science to a broad audience that might not have a scientific background. And that's something you can do at any level, as an undergraduate, as a graduate student. After graduate school, you can start writing op-eds, working. I forgot to mention also for students, the National Science Policy Network, I did a memo writing workshop that they hosted. And so I think anything you can do to increase your communication skills and take opportunities to practice those would make you more competitive. And just demonstrating your curiosity to learn new things and being open to being put in environments that you might not have much experience in, because that's definitely been a big part of my science policy experience.
Great, and I'll echo both Annalise and Reba's comments. Those are all things that we're certainly looking for in the selection committee at APS. The last kind of piece on this I want to touch on is skills that you've developed, either prior to coming to these roles in science policy, or you've developed during your time in science policy that you think have helped make you successful at your job. And so maybe we'll start with David here.
Sure, thanks, Mark. So skills that I guess I came into it with. So just a little exposition of my background. I have an undergraduate degree in astronomy and astrophysics, as Mid had mentioned, but compared to the PhDs that my fellow panelists here have, I was definitely not at the same level of scientific technical knowledge. So where I entered policy was actually kind of one of the lowest levels at the National Academy of Sciences. So I was actually coming into it, and I'd never taken a course in public policy either. So I knew nothing about it. But I was interested in it, and I wanted to move to DC because all my friends were there, because it's a very practical way to do things when you're 23 or 24, whenever that was, many moons ago. And I found that a lot of the things I learned in my undergraduate program in astronomy and astrophysics at Michigan were relevant to the work I was doing in policy. And those were, of course, skepticism, understanding data, understanding trends, even just being able to speak the same language as the other technical people within science and technology policy. I may not have understood magnetic confinement fusion and that sort of thing, or plasma physics or elementary particle physics, but it still had the lexicon of the physics community and the astronomy community. And so I could relate to the people who were at these high positions in academia and industry and government who understand all these technical principles, but also had very influential policy roles. And I think just even that basic, simple thing allowed me to connect with them and kind of continue to expand my understanding and interest in policy.
Great. Reba, would you like to follow on that?
Sure. When you're talking about skills, one thing that I think is really important, especially of those of us who are either trained or are in training as scientists, is and just to build on what Annalise said, communication is incredibly important, and that is both verbal communication but also written communication. In policy, one of the key skills is writing, and writing in clear ways, in very succinct ways. That was a big new learning curve for me. I am not a succinct person by nature. So learning how to do sort of bottom line up front, you have a 400-page report with an executive summary that's 6 pages long, and you have 3 sentences to pull out the key thing to tell the person who's at the top of the food chain about what this is and why it's important to them. So learning writing skills and paying attention to the writing skills that you do get through your science training and so whether that journal papers and whatever are great practice, but they are, and writing grant proposals, but they are not the same kind of writing. And so it's often there's a sort of a journalistic quality sometimes to the writing, in the sense that you have to bring things forward in a very short period of time. So if you are somebody who likes blogging or those kinds of things, those are great ways to practice.
Great, thanks. Great answers. And now if we want to transition from kind of the application process, these various fellowships, into what you all do on a day-to-day basis and what aspects you like about science policy. So we have a question from Jacob that came in and I think this is, it'd be great to hear from each one of you. What might a day in the life, your day-to-day life look like in terms of, when you're a science policy fellow, as you are, Annalise, or in the case of a professional like David? So Neha, do you want to start?
Sure, I could start. So I have been in the Office of Integrative Activities within the Office of the Director. And most of my work consists of coming up with research questions to address either policy changes that we might be thinking about at the National Science Foundation, or look at the impact of a pilot project, something like that. So for me, I've had those ongoing projects that are sort of running in parallel, and they're informed by different people across the foundation all the time. But then from time to time, it also happens that there's an urgent ask, say, from the Office of the Director. And so then there's something that needs to get done that day because it's required in the Office of the Director yesterday. And so while there is, for me, the big transition from the research world to science policy in the Office of the Director was that in the research world, I defined my own projects. I knew exactly what I was going to be doing on a daily basis, on a weekly basis, on a monthly basis. It was all planned to the T. And I think what I've learned a lot through the fellowship is this sort of adaptability that I need to have in the way that I work, and the ability to switch quickly between things and fit into this teamwork setup much more than I had to as a researcher, for sure. Also, the ability to communicate clearly when multiple people are working on the same project. So those have been the main things that I've been working on, and the ways in which I have to change how I work.
Great, thanks, Neha. And I'll say it's been very similar. APS, Office of Government Affairs, right? We pride ourselves on being nimble, being able to react quickly to things, and we've found, right, for the last several months in this new state, the need to do so. Annalise, would you like to follow up with some of your day-to-day experiences?
Sure. Yeah. So I'm just finishing up my first year of the AAAS Policy Fellowship. and have renewed for a second year, but I'm still very much in kind of the growing period of trying to figure out that transition from academia, like Neha mentioned, where I planned my schedule out and I had control over my time. And that what I've realized, especially since the pandemic has started, as I plan out my schedule in advance and I have like a reasonable amount of meetings, and then all of my office's meetings, not all of them, but many get planned the same week or the same day. And so it's trying to adjust and get used to a policy environment where things are happening in the moment has definitely been a big transition. In terms of kind of a day in the life, lots of meetings, lots of emails, but I really enjoyed the transition. My research was computational, and so it was me alone at a computer most of the time. And so it's been wonderful getting to interact with people more often. And even when it's over some sort of Zoom-like technology, it's still been really fun to have more opportunities to use my communication skills in ways other than writing academic journal articles. But in my position in the Office of Secretary of Defense for Policy, and particularly in this stabilization team, I'm not really doing research myself. I see myself more as a connector and looking for opportunities where I recognize that there is science out there that could be used to inform better decision making, and trying to find ways to bring those scientists in. And so, I mean, sometimes I'm asked science questions, usually not even really related to my background. People are like, "Oh, great, you're a climate scientist." And I was like, no, I'm a hydrologist. I study water. They're like, "Oh, close enough." So the science that I do is often usually not my specialty, but really I think the main value add that I can bring is trying to find ways to make sure that the science that's out there is being used as much as possible.
Great. And I did my fellowship in the California state legislature. I had the very similar experience, right? Anything that even sounded remotely science-based was immediately put on my desk, regardless of whether it had anything to do with my expertise in chemical engineering or not. David, as a representative from a scientific society, OSA, do you want to talk a little bit about your day-to-day activities?
Sure. Of course, the short answer is email and Zoom, but I think everybody knows that. But really, the bigger picture, of the day-to-day is what we're trying to achieve in our jobs. And for my part, like, I'll give you an example. My first day at OSA, which I think was May 21st, 2018, it was memorable because, I got the keys to the building. They showed me where the bathrooms are, where the parking garage is. And then also I got, an email through our National Photonics Initiative that here's the draft bill for the National Quantum Initiative, which is like nearly $1.3 billion authorization bill out of House Science Committee, which ultimately became law like 6 or 7 months later. It's like, review this and get us comments back in a week. So, those days exist, and those are, kind of frightening, but also really neat. And that's kind of one of the reasons I got into more direct advocacy at OSA, as opposed to my previous employer, where I learned a tremendous amount, by the way. So you have those days, and we've also been working on creating an optics and photonics. Optics and photonics is the field, or fields really, that OSA's community resides in, and we've been working to create an optics photonics caucus on the Hill. It's a group of congressional members with a common interest group. And then we also have large international initiatives focused actually in the environmental monitoring and measurement space, partnering with organizations, universities, governments around the world to set up monitoring systems. So the day-to-day work is kind of keeping everything moving, checking on things, making connections, trying to think of what you haven't thought of yet, ways to get things done. But in the larger scheme, it's those goals that we work towards on a day-to-day basis.
Great. I'm going to switch it up just a little bit for you, Reba. We have a question from one of the attendees, Mark, asking what sorts of parts of policy have you realized that you liked a lot, and maybe some that you are not as interesting to you, and maybe some that you thought would be interesting, right? It turns out they aren't. How is you're several years now in science policy. Talk a little bit about your experiences there.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of it that I like. I also enjoyed what Annalise was talking about being a connector, about bringing things together, about looking at kind of my job as both when I was in Kairos, but now is kind of a very 50,000 foot view of everything, but you also are able to kind of survey a very broad landscape and bring things together. So bring together people, bring together ideas, see how all kinds of different organizations are kind of trying to think about a policy problem, and then go and, you know, kind of cherry pick, oh, these are really great ideas. How can we bring those together, bring them to people who might be able to do something about them, whether, you know, when it was in Congress, whether it's legislatively, or whether, you know, if it's a National Science Board, it's a question of being able to talk about it in a policy space, or write a policy paper that's relevant, or have talk about it in congressional testimony. So that part's really interesting. I discovered, I guess, fairly early that one of the things I did like was kind of being close to the sort of the in the room where it happens bit, where you're kind of close to the people who are the decision makers and really helping them by bringing forth information to them. So staffing, what we call in policy land, staffing principles, like being with the people who are actually the decision makers. And that is a high pressure environment. But it's lots of very fast turnaround, as Neha was describing, and others, right, where you can suddenly have something land on your desk and it's like 5 minutes later, like you need, oh, you know, when do we need this? I remember the first time that happened to me in the Senate, where I was asked to do something, and they're like, well, I'm like, well, when do you need this? And they're like, well, I don't know, an hour. And it's the sort of thing that, you know, in your previous life, in your research life, you might have given a week or two to kind of really think about and do some research on. And they're like, no, we need the best information you have in an hour. You're like, okay. So that is great for me. Other people may not find that so great, right? I thrived in that kind of environment. So the thing about policy is that everybody has things that they discover that they're really enjoyed, that you're surprised by, and things where you're like, not so much. So some people in these policy positions find themselves doing, say, program administration or evaluation. And that I quickly discovered was not the sort of thing I wanted to do. That, you know, kind of that it's closer to maybe what one is familiar with research. Kind of you have a task and a thing that you're trying to do, and you have, you know, kind of tasks that can be somewhat ordered, and then evaluation in terms of looking at data that come in and say, you know, was this program successful? And a lot of people enjoy that as a policy role, but that's something I discovered that I wasn't particularly interested in doing. It was a little too close, perhaps, to the sort of kind of research, and I was more interested in a sort of dynamic environment and these kind of keeping everything on the hopper. But that's not for everybody.
That's a great answer, Reba, and that really, I think, ties nicely into another question we have from Cameron Clark. And he asks, is there a strong distinction between working on policy for the practice of science, right, policy for science, versus the application of scientific knowledge or, you know, technological or other policy problems? So open to anybody wants to kind of jump in on this, the, you know, difference between working on policy for science versus science for policy.
So I could get started there, and then people can hop in. So just to start with definitions a little bit, science for policy, I see it as when scientists, engineers, and doctors or healthcare professionals, they're the ones providing data that would inform policymakers, so that they can make informed decisions, science-informed decisions. And policy for science, on the other hand, is that part of public policy, which would affect the conduct of the science and research enterprise. And usually you would do that so that it will align with other national policy goals. Given that distinction, I would say that they're obviously completely interdependent. You know, even though they sound like they're opposite things when you say them, science for policy and policy for science, they're completely locked in with each other. You can't really have one without the other. I can speak from my experience because it's mainly policy for science. So the National Science Foundation, what I work on is how can we formulate policies at NSF that would align the nation's science and engineering research and education goals with the outcomes that we want. And so that's been most of my work. And I found that very rewarding, very interesting. I can't really speak for the other side because I've worked I mean, my connection with science for policy is, yes, I was a scientist and I produced data, but I wasn't the one, using that directly to inform policymakers in any way. So I'll let someone else speak to that side of it.
Anyone else want to jump in? Annalise?
Sure. Yeah, I can. Because yeah, I'm glad that you could talk about the policy for science, because I feel like I've only participated on the other side, on the science for policy, or at least tried to help with that. And I see, and kind of getting back to that like day-to-day role a little bit, I'm trying to find researchers and find research out there that identifies connections, for example, as a hydrologist, between drought and instability in sub-Saharan Africa, for example. And my office is working closely with State Department and USAID to try to make sure that we prevent violence and conflict, and we increase stability, and we're working on it through the Global Fragility Act right now. And through that process, I try to make sure that all of the best science that's been done and the evidence can be used to make sure that we're making policies that really are reflecting our understanding of the ways that environmental conditions might have an impact on conflict or instability.
Reba, it looked like you might have wanted to jump in as well.
I was just going to echo what Neha said about the fact that these things are very interlinked, and we kind of do both things in my office as sort of, we do policy that kind of governs how the science, as a governing board that governs how the science is funded, but we also, and we don't take scientific results directly to policymakers, but as you were when, Mark, when you were saying when you're in Congress, you become, say you're a congressional fellow, you often become the scientist, right? So everything lands on your desk. You're in the office, you're the scientist. Doesn't matter if it's your field, doesn't matter if it isn't. The point is that you as a scientist are expected to be able to understand understand the basics of data, understand statistics, look at things and say, this is a reliable result, this is not a reliable source, and this is not. And that is part of what you bring to it. So when you think about bringing science to bear on policies, or just bring science to policymakers, it may not just be in your own specific area, but it could be a place where the policymakers are relying on your knowledge of statistics, data, of how science is done to assess whether something that they have seen or whether it's something that they're asked to look at is kind of scientifically sound. And then that is the thing that you're bringing to them. So it's not necessarily your specific discipline expertise, but the expertise of the practice of science and understanding how that works. And that is what you're bringing to the policymaker in terms of, kind of telling that what your expertise is when you're the scientist. So that's just something to be aware of, because I think people sometimes come in and think they're going to be able to do. And I was an astronomer too, so you think, well, what is an astronomer going to tell a policymaker? Like, what, they're not really asking you about black holes very often. But the question is, can you assess and can you do a good job of assessing kind of the scientific framework under which something is being presented, and give a judgment on that. And that's where the value is, not necessarily in your discipline expertise.
Great answer. And I'll say just, at APS and our Office of Government Affairs, we're doing both, right? So certainly we, advocate, lobby policymakers for policies to benefit, right, that would be best for the scientific community and the physics community in particular. And certainly we work with our colleagues like David and others on those efforts. And we also have studies, right, commissioned by the APS panel on public affairs that look at the science behind particular things that will inform policy decisions. And there's we've done a lot in both the nuclear weapons space, missile defense, et cetera, on those issues. I'm going to turn now to some other questions from the attendees. Here's a question that I'm happy to answer, but see if other folks have input. How does the type of work/work environment differ between a science policy position within government and one within an NGO or nonprofit organization? seeing nobody jumping at this, I'll comment. In my case, so I worked in the California state legislature, and obviously now I'm at APS. In both cases, there's a lot of similarities in that my primary goal in both positions was to represent constituency, right? So in California, I worked for a member who represented residents who lived just east of Sacramento and pushed for policies, laws that were important to him, his district, and would benefit his members. And we do the same thing. I do the same thing now at APS, right? An organization that represents more than 54,000 physicists. Differences, working for an elected official who a lot of times is up for election every 2 years and is looking at very short-term decision making versus working for an organization like APS that has the panel on public affairs who really take the long-term view of the society. Certainly, we respond to policies in the moment, but we also are looking at long-standing positions. So there's similarities and differences. I would say I've enjoyed both roles, and they both have both opportunities and challenges. Moving on, I'm just going to pull some more questions here. This is really for anyone. This is a great question. Is there anything you wish you'd known or done differently when you were first getting involved in your career or in the fellowship that you would do differently now?
Sorry, I guess. I'd say, as I mentioned, I didn't take any public policy classes. I wish I had. It probably would have given me a little jump start just to understand the basic civics of the U.S. government. Not being a little facetious, but even having a rudimentary understanding of how policy works, why politics exist. And in fact, just a brief anecdote, for many, many years, I kind of abhorred politics. There was an Otto von Bismarck's, you never want to see how laws or sausages are made, or, something like that. And that was kind of what I took to heart. Then I got involved in policy, kind of fell backwards into it, getting a job at the academies, and I found that I really enjoyed it. So just even having had some familiarity or exposure to policy or politics and keeping an open mind about areas or even professions that I was unaware of would have benefited me. I think maybe it would have driven me in this direction earlier, or at least with fuller knowledge of what I was getting into.
Yeah, right. I echo your comments, David. I entered the California state legislature knowing absolutely nothing about certainly California state government and just due to people I had interacted with before, whatever, right? A lot of the comments were, why do you want to get involved in sausage making? So we're in a few questions from people attending about folks who are mid-career, late career opportunities for them. And so just, throw it out there as an example. Marco's asking, is it possible to enter science policy arena as a later career choice? And if folks have comments on that, maybe colleagues you're working with, et cetera.
Well, I'll jump in because I spent 20 years in research before I switched. So I was mid-career when I started. It is the nice thing about the AAAS fellowship, just to put in a plug here, and also the congressional ones generally from, I think the scientific societies are also in general have this, is that they do not have an age or career stage limitation. Some of the other fellowships that you will see around DC are like, for early career folks, so within 5 years of a terminal degree, for example. But the AAAS fellowships, executive and congressional branch versions, are not. You can come in at any stage, and I had colleagues in the AAAS fellowship that were coming right out of graduate students, coming right out of postdocs, like me, about mid-career, sort of have people on sabbatical from faculty positions. They were on 1-year sabbaticals, and then we saw people who were coming in basically kind of intending to retire from their from whatever position they were in, and they were joining the fellowship partly to explore it, to see to sort of maybe it's an end career sort of thing. But then some of them stayed on and found a second career even at that stage. So there's a lot to be said for that. And I would say, kind of relating to the previous question, I'm kind of glad I did not do this right at the early outset of my career, because one of the things that I learned that I brought, I think, to the fellowship and then to the positions that I'm in now is a knowledge of how the science enterprise works, both in the country and globally. So, because I was overseas for a long time, so I had some sense of large scale facilities and budgets and how things, how we prioritize things, funding agencies, kind of what the global landscape looked like. And I was able to bring all of those things into the fellowship when I was thinking about them, that sort of sense of the global enterprise and the national enterprise. So there's a lot of room for people who are mid-career who want to, and because the nice thing about coming in through a fellowship is that it's not a commitment. So, you come in for a year, you can come for 2 years. If you decide that you want to take that knowledge back to your academic career, you can or other career, you can absolutely do that, or you can use it as a jumping off point for a new phase of your career. But there's no reason not to come in. There's a lot of mid-career and later career fellows.
Great. We've got a question from Stephanie Mack, who's asking, and maybe this piggybacks on Reba's answer. How did you all think about the fellowship in terms of your long-term career goals, right? That is, say, when you first applied, were you looking at this as just a 1 to 2 year opportunity, or did it shape, or were you thinking about staying in DC or just the science policy space more broadly when you were going through that application process? Maybe we'll go to Annalise.
Sure. Yeah. And actually, just to the last question, I just thought I would quickly mention, I know that the AAAS, there's policy fellowship, there are affinity groups, and I know there's a fellows over 50 affinity group. And so there's lots of fellows of all ages. Yeah, I mean, I was interested in doing the fellowship because I really knew I wanted to get into policy and saw it as a way to hopefully get into federal government, though I have to admit I never thought I'd end up at DOD, and that piece of it, deciding to go to DOD, was a decision to take advantage of the fellowship to do something totally different that I didn't have any background in: defense, security, military, no understanding of any of that when I started a year ago. And so deciding to go to DOD was this realization I wanted to use the fellowship to just get a completely different experience. That said, knowing that I am hoping to stay probably in either federal or local government, and use the fellowship as a way to kind of transition from academia, at least for now, potentially leaving open other opportunities in the future. But I think it is a really great way. I think you have to check my statistics, but I believe the AAAS policy fellows, about a third afterward stay in their current agency, a third go back to academia, and a third or stay in federal government, not necessarily their current agency, a third. And so there's lots of different paths after the fellowship, but it is a really great way to get into government and policy.
Great. Other comments?
So I'd like to say that when I started the fellowship, I had no clue what I would want to do with it at the end. I was interested in policy when I applied. I did complete a semester-long workshop at UNC, which sort of cemented my intentions for sure. So I knew for sure that I wanted to be in policy. I didn't know where I would end up. I knew I wanted to be at the National Science Foundation. So I had bits and pieces of the puzzle. I didn't have the whole picture. And I think during the course of the fellowship, I was able to fill in those bits and pieces of the puzzle that I didn't have. And that's really given me a sense of what I want to achieve in terms of my career goal in science policy. And I'm hoping to stick around as well, which is not something that I might have thought before the fellowship.
Great. So we've got 5 to 8 minutes left, and there's still several questions that are coming in. So I'm going to try to get through as many as possible. I'm going to combine a couple, one from Fiona and one from Barbara. And that is kind of two points. One, do you have advice on organizations that students can join in order to gain experience in science policy, and partnering with that? Any advice on how to balance, right, that volunteer advocacy work you might be doing while you're in graduate school and all the the pressures you have to complete your research?
Yeah, I can start off. Thanks. Those are good questions. Or I can at least take the first part. I think it was Annalise, actually, you mentioned the Congressional Visits Day earlier today. And so a few of the societies, well, many of them actually, APS, OSA, my organization, AGU, many of them organize what are called Congressional Visits Days. This is where people, scientists or what have you, come from all over the country, and visits with your congressional representatives in the Senate and House are organized, and you're kind of led around by, you know, a policy professional from that society, or a scientist who's done these visits a lot, and you're given training, and you're kind of given the general messages and taught how to communicate it to very busy congressional staff. Sometimes you have 5 minutes in a hallway, sometimes you have half an hour, you never know, or with the member of Congress themselves. And those can be really valuable, rewarding experiences. And at least for OSA's part, a lot of the people who end up on our Public Policy Council, which is an internal committee of volunteers, scientists, engineers from the community, started with the Congressional Visits Day program. Our societies, I know we all offer it a couple times a year. It's a little different now. We're doing a virtual one in a couple weeks. And I know AGU has done a virtual one. So they're still going on. They're great ways to just kind of dip your toe in it, and just to see what it's like, and to meet other people who are interested in it and learn about why they're interested.
It's great. Yeah, as David mentioned, APS has a Congressional Visit Day that's done in concert with our all leadership meeting. But additionally, for APS, we have lots of grassroots activities going on at all times. If you go to our website, aps.org, click on the Policy and Advocacy tab, you can find your way there. We do everything from enabling members to send letters, phone calls, tweets, etc., to their members of Congress, to helping members write op-eds, to scheduling in-person, well, now would be virtual meetings in state or in district for you to meet with your representative or senator staff locally, so you actually don't have to travel to DC to do so. And so anybody interested in those activities, I encourage you to find your way to our website. Another question coming through, maybe now in the last couple minutes, we can get to some more, I don't want to say controversial questions, but some might be a little more interesting. And so one comes from Kevin. Do you find that policymakers will disregard scientific input if it doesn't comport with their desired policy outcomes? And so anybody's welcome to answer, but I could certainly speak from a one personal experience I've had. And it looks like I should be happy to, oh, Reba?
I'm gonna jump in and say a couple things. One is, it depends. So obviously there's differences between whether you're talking to a partisan political person in Congress, or you're talking about the executive branch and what kinds of things are done there. It's very situational. People should not come into a position like this assuming that they're going to be able to change someone's mind if they've got it completely made up for a political or partisan reason. Sometimes people come into congressional fellowships thinking, well, I'll be able to bring the data and they'll change their mind, and get, or sadly, in a rude awakening. But one thing that you should keep in mind is that there are multiple, it's not we talk about scientific data like that's the only axis on which the discussions are, on which decisions are made, and they are not. There are economic axes, there's obviously ideological ones, there's local interests, there's national interests, there's industry, there's all kinds of different competing. So you think, oh, it doesn't make any sense, why are they making a decision based on this? And you have to look at this much broader range of axes on which they are measuring things. And it is not just about, you have to look at where the scientific data you always want to bring to the table, and you always want it to be in a conversation, but it's not going to, often not the determinative factor. So one of the things you have to do is to learn to look for places of contact with people. Where are there places where you can, with a policymaker, that you can have a mutual understanding or a mutual point of contact, that you can have a discussion where you're not just at loggerheads, right? And that you look for an entry point to a conversation where you have something in common that you can discuss. And then you can start to bring in things like, additional information. Does that mean you'll change in somebody's mind if they're completely ideologically made up? No. but there are places where you can move the needle, and it certainly was successfully done. Quite famously, Lamar Smith, who used to chair the House Science Committee, had very little time or interest in social, behavioral, and economic sciences. And was constantly kind of down on that, and then tried to defund it a bunch of times. And over years of interaction with the former director of the National Science Foundation, with former board chairs, and they worked on him. They kind of had respectful dialogue, interesting dialogue. And by the time he retired from Congress, he was like, well, maybe the social sciences are useful for things like anti-terrorism and defense in these places. Maybe there is a place for that. And so over time, they found where those mutual interest places were, and they were able to bring him to a different place in his consideration. It's a long process. It requires relationship building. It isn't something where you walk in with data and you hand it over to someone and say, see, I was right. It requires this whole other thing.
Couldn't agree more. And I'm also happy that I don't have to provide details of my personal anecdote experience to this. And with just a couple minutes left, I want to end on just real short answer from everybody, just to just get your personal opinion on what you see as the most important, the most critical, etc. Science policy issue, let's say, today going in, for let's say about the next year. Annalise, we'll just start with you.
It's a big question. I mean, I always fall back on water issues, and that's kind of a cop-out, but that is my expertise. So I like having the opportunity to talk about things that I feel more knowledgeable about, even if it doesn't always happen. And so, yeah, I mean, I think trying to address changes in water resources and water security in terms of floods and recent storms and droughts in other places. I don't know, those are the things that I'm thinking about.
Great. Neha?
So again, given my background, I would say that one of the most critical things for us would be to find convergence, not just in scientific research itself, but convergence of research and science with real life problems. Right? So that's where I feel like there's a gap, where you have scientists on one side, and on the other side you have sort of the real world, for lack of better words. And so some way to, and I think having more people involved in science policy is actually a way to do that, is to build that bridge, right, and find convergence between the scientific research that's actually happening versus the bigger problems that we face as a nation and as a planet. So I would say that would be, yeah.
Reba?
So I was debating between two different things, and I'll just touch on both of them. One is that obviously one of the things that we need is for, to kind of move everybody back to a place where expertise is a thing that is valued and listened to. And I think I will have to say that I think it's overblown. At some level, there's a lot of surveys about this, that it's overblown, that people do not respect. Scientists still command very high respect and trust amongst the American public, and in worldwide as well. And but we need to get to with a lot of the problems that are facing us. There's a lot of input that science and technology will have into solving those problems. But we need people to be able to communicate about that in a way that garners trust amongst the people who are going to be electing representatives and whatnot, and electing governments, and then those folks who are elected need to also be able to be willing to listen and be interested in reaching out for expertise. So we need to, on our part, part of it is the communication and making sure that when we bring that out, we're doing it effectively.
For time constraints, I'm going to hold you to that one, and I'm going to give David very quickly.
I'd say generally the state of the research environment, and that includes equity and equitable opportunities issues, immigration policy, and just the sustenance of the research enterprise. And it's being hammered by the pandemic and other things.
Great, thanks. Well, I'm going to toss it back to Midhat now to close things out, but I'll just say it's a delight to speak with you all today and appreciate you giving your candid comments and opinions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark, for moderating this panel, and thank you all our panelists and Mark for offering us your time and insights today. This was wonderful. This concludes the panel portion of today's event. We apologize if we did not get to your questions, but we encourage you to follow up by sending an email to webinars@aps.org, or you can also join us for the interactive part of the event in just a few minutes. We will be sending you a follow-up email with a recording of the panel discussion from today, as well as a survey within 5 business days. In order to help APS continue to develop quality webinar presentations, please help us by filling out the short survey that you will receive. While today's panel wraps up the APS Summer Webinar Series, I do want to let you know that we will continue to bring you webinars on exciting topics. Next week, we have a talk on considering a career at a national laboratory. And the week after, we are kicking off a new series on success in industry careers. So if you are interested, please sign up to stay informed on all upcoming webinars. The link is on my slide, but we will also be sending it in the follow-up email. Okay, so now we are going to move to the interactive Zoom meeting. If you would like to continue this conversation and discussion, please join the Zoom meeting that my colleague will share with you soon in the chat. While only three out of our 4 panelists will be available to join for this part, we will have a bonus breakout room with our moderator, Mark, as well as Charlotte Selton, who is a special projects organizer within the Office of Government Affairs. She pursued a science policy career straight out of her bachelor's degree, so Charlotte can offer insight and guidance to any undergraduate students on the call today. So thank you all so much for joining us, and we hope to see you again shortly or at a future webinar. You may now call in to the link that my colleague will be sharing in the chat. Otherwise, have a nice day.